I'm particularly interested in the relationship between military intelligence and the tactical and operational conduct of war. That's more to where this research is going. And it's intended to build on the work of some people like Ken Kotani, Douglas Ford, and Edward Dray, who've looked at the Imperial Japanese Army in quite a lot of detail in relatively recent years. And in short, the paper looks at the ideological constraints within the Imperial Japanese Army when it came to achieving insight and execution, that being the accurate perception of the enemy and the conditions of the war zone and the process of effectively adapting to them. And those were the words used by Lieutenant General John Cushman in Williamson Murray's book on military effectiveness, which I've found very useful. And I'm hopeful the paper can begin to explore the influence of the IGA's well-known ideological component on its military intelligence, its use and conceptions of it. And also just add a little bit to the discussion about the influence of ideology and institutional culture on military intelligence. And the image here is from the Library of Congress, and it shows sort of bloated Russian troops begging for some Yamato Damashi, which is sort of Japanese warrior spirit, Japanese uniqueness, spiritual uniqueness. And this is from after the Russo-Japanese War. And I think it visualizes quite well some of the themes present in the paper. It shows an early confluence of ideology and doctrine. It's saying that, it's the spirit of the army that's being cited as the deciding factor here, not so much technology or how many tanks are the size of our guns and things like that. And although this is not unique, of course, the Americans and the British all had posters about bravery and things like that. I think it's telling in its conviction, the level this has been taken to, which will become quite important. Okay. So the paper describes sort of three trends in the period that provide context for the development of Imperial Japanese Army culture and their conceptions of war and intelligence. The first is the sort of experience of war, and this was important for the development and entrenchment of traditionalist doctrine and the development of institutional culture within the IGA. The Russo-Japanese War in particular was formative in terms of tactics and doctrine. I don't really have time to go into a lot of detail, but feel free to ask later. And I find this particularly interesting because although the Russo-Japanese War is often cited as a sort of missed opportunity for Western powers in relation to how World War I was conducted, when there was doctrinal disagreement in the 1920s and 1930s, the traditionalist faction in the IGA, they actually overlooked their own experience as well as the experience of World War I, which they did receive. They weren't majorly engaged, but they did receive a lot of information and intelligence. The second is factionalism, or what's called gunbatsu in Japanese. And this is a really strong characteristic of the IGA throughout its history. Again, it's a very complex topic, and there were many, many different types of factionalism, but the end results are what's important, in that you had things like nepotism, political wrangling, both internal army politics and external politics, and resentment. And this was initially based on historical clan rivalries from the samurai period, the Meiji period, basically, and before. And an interesting side note here is actually the two main ones, which you may have heard of, Choshu and Satsuma. Choshu actually dominated the Imperial Japanese Army. They were the biggest faction, whereas Satsuma dominated the Navy, but both were present in each, if that makes sense. And that exacerbated the inter-service rivalries and problems, which most, I think, military historians would be aware of in the Japanese armed forces during the Second World War. The most significant of these factional struggles for our purposes is that between doctrinal traditionalists and progressive modernizers, especially in the post-World War I years in the 20s and 30s, because both sides surrounded themselves with these kind of like-minded acolytes and proteges. When the Seishin, which is the word often used for this sort of idea of spiritual predominance in the army, they would win through Japanese spirit and bravery and obedience. When this clique managed to get its kind of claws into various important positions in the army, they were able to block and water down modernization proposals that conflicted with these Seishin-based doctrines and ideals. Things, for example, like armor doctrine and artillery development. And the third is the military-civilian divide. Now, this became wider throughout the period covered, so that the sort of first half of the 20th century, due to the factionalism mentioned, especially amongst politicians in the armed forces. And this eventually led to multiple assassinations of government people and army officers, and eventually a coup in February 1936 by radicalists of the Imperial Way faction. And although that was put down, it drove a wedge even deeper between the army and the civilian authorities. The effect of this that's important for us is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Navy, and the Army all were basically drifting apart in intelligence terms in the first half of the 20th century. And this led to duplication of intelligence efforts and also strategic confusion, and those two things led into each other, as we'll try and get on to later. So the complete independence of the IGA from civilian interference, this prerogative that they had, they answered only to the emperor, it left them to pursue their own intelligence agenda, which left them open to excessive influence from their own ideologies, mindsets, and institutional cultures, all things which I think we know are, can be quite detrimental to intelligence work. One of the most salient examples of this is their intelligence focus on their traditional enemy, the USSR. They had this idea of the Hokushinron, the Northern Advance, up until relatively soon before World War II started, and they actually went south to the European colonies. Now they focused on the USSR. IGA intelligence was focused on the USSR into mid-1943, and there are suggestions that it took Hirohito himself asking if it might not be a good idea to perhaps start looking at the enemy that was basically sinking all their aircraft carriers and capturing all the territory they'd taken, the US and the UK. Another significant influence is the poor relations between the civilian scientific and industrial institutions and their army counterparts. And Peter Gudgeon has a very, very good book on this. And it would have significant implications for how military intelligence was used and developed in the army during the war. Okay, the 3 points we're going to look at are the sort of 3 main influences of this traditionalist militarism that took hold in the interwar years. The first is I feel that the IGA's conception of military intelligence was as a mission-focused or operational tool, and as something that should only be practiced or directed by the army. The second is this Sation-centric doctrine, because it ensured that army development both before and during the war was constrained by its often deleterious principles. The foundations of the Sation doctrine themselves caused a sort of filtering of military intelligence. And the third is IGA, what I've called military chauvinism, this IGA self-perception as well as their views on non-Japanese, which were often seen through a lens of cultural nationalism that's referred to as Nihon Jinron. I think in George Lynn's book, he talked a little bit about that, the racial aspect of the Pacific War influencing the experience of the war for the Allies, not so much the conduct. And I know there are counter arguments to that, but I would say for the Japanese side, this sort of ideology influenced both the conduct, or not necessarily their views of the opponents, but their views of themselves as well, definitely influenced their conduct as well as their experience of the war. So the first then, these sort of conceptualization issues. Most of the IGA leadership seem not to see the role of military intelligence beyond the operational assistance and planning that it had been used for basically from 1895 with victory over China in the First Sino-Japanese War through to 1941, the invasion of Malaya, for example, and with the Japanese Navy, the attack in Pearl Harbor. They were very well planned tactically. Now, the invasion of Malaya, what came after, I think, is a very good example of this. So the Nakano Intelligence School, which is pictured, trained hundreds of officers, and they were selected quite specifically to be very non-IJA types, very non-army types. They mostly came from reservist officers, not professionals. And these served in intelligence units called Tokumikikan. And these were basically very effective in their intelligence or their invasion planning. They established local contacts, gathered topographical data, and really did well to guide the army, even into Burma as well later on. However, with the conclusion of the First Burma campaign in 1942, Southern Army intelligence was actually stood down. It wasn't seen as being useful anymore. You know, we've got the land that we now want to hold. For now, we're not going any further. And many of the officers in these Kikan were basically reassigned to more political roles with nationalist Indian and Burmese groups. And although they could possibly do some good work there, it's kind of indicative of the army attitude to them. You know, you can do this practical work. We've got a mission to do. Otherwise, go away and do your political intelligence stuff. And that's a theme that will come up. They were seen as not very martial. They weren't in one of the sort of you know, good or martial or military parts of the army. The Second Bureau as well throughout the war was often ignored. Sorry, Second Bureau was their military intelligence, was often ignored or circumvented by the First Bureau, the Operations Department, when they disagreed. And this is perhaps due to a lack of clear relationship outlined when they were actually divided out of the old Prussian system in 1908. And similar to the British Army, at least at the start of World War II, intelligence was not seen as a career path. And as I said before, the practitioners were often seen as quibblers and non-martial. Anyone who chose to stay there for an extended period wasn't really regarded, although some well-known Japanese officers did spend time in intelligence. As I mentioned, there was also this continued focus of the USSR into 1943, which I feel shows a sort of dislocation between military intelligence and Imperial Japanese Army command. And I think it compounds the idea that military intelligence was seen as an operational tool to be used and directed by the army rather than as part of a total warfighting machinery that it could give input to. Finally, on this point, I think that this narrow conception also contributed to this lack in interest in working with civilian institutions and particularly with the Navy, which of course is very short-sighted in a total war situation. So to round off this part here, then the IG's conception of military intelligence in World War II, I feel, was broadly as it had been at the turn of the century, and its leadership took too long to expand their conceptions to a total war level in the way that the Allies did. There was little acceptance of total war requirements, despite warnings from their own intelligence officers in the interwar period. They did have officers in the IG that were warning about this sort of stuff. I think Yamamoto is a famous example of, you know, he said that they would run amok, the Navy that is, would run amok for 6 months to a year. There were people in the army saying similar things. The next one then is the filtering effect of IGE doctrine on military intelligence. Now, because of its strong doctrinal foundations and sort of deep ideological roots, the IGA's strict control over research and development, as I said, they didn't really like working with civilian institutions, and when they did, they directed them, they didn't really work with them. That meant that military intelligence, coming back from the battlefield, for example, was being used to reinforce doctrines and conceptions rather than challenging and improving them. Again, they didn't want to undermine these Seisin-based ideals. And if you have an ideal which says, you know, technology is not everything, rely on the offensive spirit, you know, get in amongst the enemy, break through them. If you've got that as a cornerstone of your doctrine, it's difficult for the army to then do a bit of a volte-face and turn around and say, you know, we need bigger guns and more of them. An example of this would be back in the 1920s when there was plans for modernization. General Tanaka Kunishige, who was actually seen as a modernizer compared to the traditionalists, he called heavy artillery and machine guns a European and American conceit, which is bold words. By World War II, the IG had a doctrine which basically precluded developments based on battlefield intelligence, because many of the recommendations, such as more and better technology or shifts to defensive battles as the war started going against them, undermined the foundations of their Seisin-based doctrine. Real improvement was slowed by these doctrinal underpinnings, and by the time weaknesses were acknowledged, the Allied industrial preponderance and the Air Sea campaign had rendered any response moot or very difficult to act in. In the IG developments that we do know of, or are quite well known, are really based on this Seisin doctrine. Things like the Key 115, like a purpose-built suicide plane, lunge mines, instead of developing something along the lines of the Panzerfaust as the Germans did, they all kind of indicate this very strong doctrinal and ideological underpinnings. The IGA essentially was a military that was slow to adapt because its doctrine precluded clear-sighted analysis of themselves and their enemies by military intelligence and inflicted needless attrition rather than perceive and admit mistakes in time. And again, this Seishin, this offensive doctrine, was leading to huge casualties amongst NCOs, officers, and men, which again makes it difficult to keep knowledge within the army and also to pass it back and to make useful intelligence products out of it. Okay, sorry, I forgot to start my stop clock. Hopefully I'm not going too far over the line. I've only got 1 or 2 slides left.
Like 1 or 2 minutes would be
that should be fine, yeah. So the military cultural chauvinism is the last of the 3 here. And this was, again, part of the Japanese education, this Nihon Jinron, and part of the army's idea that it was separate and better than the rest. I'll just briefly summarize this point to keep within the time, but there were ideas, for example, that the Western forces or Allied forces were soft, especially without their technology. There was a generally disparaging view of non-white soldiers, which again would come back when they started facing well-trained Gurkha, West African and Indian soldiers. The Japanese themselves became very disheartened when they started losing repeatedly. And perhaps most important and something that's not looked at too much is the throwing away of things like the 30 comrades you can see here led by Aung San, who were part of the Burma Independence Army, which at the end of the fall of Burma was 30,000 men who were armed. And although they weren't the best trained, they could have been trained, but instead they were reduced to 3,000, used as sort of token propaganda force. And if you contrast that with the Allied use of native peoples, especially in the Burma theatre, it's very much night and day. This attitude also again contributed to this not wanting to work with civilians, not thinking they can do a job for the army. And again, an example of that is it wasn't until 1944 that foreign language students and mathematicians from Tokyo University were brought in to help. They were using IBM machines to help crack intercepts, and they had quite a good success rate in downing, for example, B-29s. Very, very useful for the Japanese at the time. Okay, I'll just go through a brief conclusion then. So my own conclusions are essentially that victory disease remains a solid argument for Japanese performance in World War II, but it can be argued that the roots were in the victories against the Russians in 04-05, not so much in 1941, since the IJ did not learn from their own experiences against Russia, China, and then the USSR no one hand effectively. IGI ideology and doctrine did serious harm to Japan's war effort by limiting the ability of military intelligence to perform key tasks of insight and execution. On the insight side of things, they couldn't form an accurate image of the enemy. The Second Bureau was poorly directed and ostracized from operational planning and decision making, which was lamented by more perceptive officers on both sides of the ops intelligence divide. The image of the enemy in occupied peoples and cultures, both civilian and military, was inaccurate, as culture and doctrine required them to be seen as lesser than the Japanese. And Allied intelligence realized the need for clarity after they realized that we can't just dismiss the Japanese once they'd suffered their defeats. They were saying we might hate these people, we might have propaganda that's very racist, but we will look at them as people and we will look at them with a level head. And self-assess, the IG cannot self-assess their own failures and setbacks in a measured way because of the same flaws. When it came to the execution part, the value placed on military intelligence activities and officers was low, and they were seen as non-martial and more political than military. The institutional culture made it easy to ignore or dismiss intelligence officers when they didn't add to the consensus. And finally, the defense establishment was not willing to use intelligence to improve its armed forces if it countered or went against this doctrinal traditionalism. And this led to decades of intelligence gathering, not just during World War II, but before it, being ignored when it conflicted with this military culture and doctrine.